General, first off, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today about such an important topic. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for covering the story because this is critically important.
I want to start by going back to this partnership with Ukraine, which spans 30 years. One of the oldest state partnerships in America. Why do we do this? And how important is it as we look at what's happening today?
So the partnership, as you said, has been for about 30 years. It was among the first partnerships of a state National Guard, which with, at the time, a former republic in the Soviet Union. And what we did is after the fall of the Soviet Union, we partnered with Ukraine from California in order to work with their military to teach them how to behave as a military that's subordinate to civil authority, where the civilians are in charge in a constitutional democracy. Today, that partnership has really come to fruition and has stood the test of time, whereas over 30 years we became closer. We helped them, the Ukrainian military, build tremendous capability and capacity, and now we're seeing those results as the Ukrainians are fighting very bravely and valiantly, and I might add very skillfully, as they face this illegal Russian invasion.
These men and women that are fighting in their armed forces on the ground and trained with them both here and in Ukraine. And you also know and can see now the resolve of the Ukrainian people as this invasion comes across. What do you make of that, and what can you speak to how resilient these people are?
So we've known all along that the Ukrainians are very tough fighters. They have great leadership. They have a lot of depth on the bench. But to see the resolve of the Ukrainian people, which isn't surprising, having spent so much time in Ukraine, that they value freedom as much, if not more, than any freedom-loving country around the globe. And they're really being put to the test. And they're going to fight very hard to preserve that freedom against this illegal invasion.
When we started this state partnership with all these Warsaw Pact countries following the Soviet Union, the goal being to help them establish democracy, reform military, and I think in many ways we've done that. But to see now a democracy potentially in limbo after all the work we've done and all the work they've done, how do you feel about that?
Well, it makes me angry with the Russians and with Mr. Putin that they think they can get away with something this illegal. And I think it surprised them of the resolve, not only of the Ukrainian people, but of not just the Western countries and the United States, but people around the globe that have categorically decried and denounced this action by them. I think that we're also seeing how effective the Ukrainian military has been and how their entire government has come together and the people have come together, put their political differences aside within the country in order to face this very dire threat.
How concerned are you that the new border of the free world may move 800 miles to the west?
At the rate things are going, I think that there is a tough row to hoe for the Russians to achieve that objective. First of all, it's illegal and it's wrong. The Ukrainians are fighting very valiantly. This remains a close-run thing, though. So as aid continues to flow into Ukraine in order to help their forces be more lethal, the Russians still have a lot of capability. We're only a little over a week into this conflict, so it still hangs in the balance. But I'm hopeful that the Ukrainian people will continue to fight, the Russians will come to their senses, and then pull out and go home.
What becomes of our partnership now that Ukraine's at war?
The partnership has never been more important and never stronger. We activated our headquarters for the California Military Department here in Sacramento as soon as the invasion began so that we could bring staff augmentation in. We're running what we call a full battle rhythm on a 24-hour cycle to be able to communicate with the Ukrainians and share their needs and what they're seeing on the battlefield with the rest of the U.S. government and with our NATO partners in order to facilitate aid, to break down any bureaucratic walls to get them what they need to sustain the fight.
And we're starting to learn that the way the West works and the way the East works is in many ways helping Ukraine. And in the sense that the structure of a despot is far different than the structure of a democratic society wanting to fight.
Absolutely, and you can see that in the performance of their armed forces. The Ukrainians have an all-volunteer military, even though they've now added conscription and brought in all men and many, many women to robust their ranks. but their military is performing extraordinarily well. You contrast that with the Russian army, which is, as you say, led by a despot in the form of Mr. Putin. That's an all-conscript army. They have low morale. They can't synchronize combat power. They're having a lot of problems. That doesn't make them any less lethal. They're still very much a problem and very dangerous, but the Ukrainians are performing extraordinarily well, and I think that's a hallmark to the underlying freedoms that the Ukrainian people practice and believe in.
Decentralized, essentially, warfare, fighting centralized warfare,
Absolutely.
top-down structure, definitely.
Absolutely, and it's a hallmark of the West, is that as generals in Western armies and in the American Army in particular, we give broad guidance and objectives to our subordinates and let them figure out how to do it. In the Russian military, they tell them a script that they have to follow. And if things don't go according to the script, it does not go well for those poor soldiers down in the lower ranks.
We discussed it briefly before we started, but are the Ukrainians better trained than the Russians?
Oh, clearly. Their Air Force is performing magnificently. And it's not just the training. They are so much more motivated. They have the will to succeed because they're on the right side and they know it.
Let's turn to President Zelensky, who I know you met a couple years back. You hosted him during his visit here in California. What was that visit like with him? And talk to me about what that was like with him.
So he's a very impressive leader. And I think that just like the rest of the Ukrainian armed forces, maybe even the Ukrainian government, people underestimated the Ukrainians. They underestimated Zelensky. They thought of him as, a comedian, a showman, not really a serious politician. My experience with him was far different. He was extraordinarily knowledgeable about his needs for his country, the political situation. He was very serious-minded and laser-like focused on what we in the Cal Guard could do to help his armed forces continue to get better.
I want to pull up something he shared with his parliament just a day ago. He quoted Churchill and saying, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." Are those words appropriate at this point in time, knowing the context? You're a military man.
So I will tell you that the Ukrainians are putting that into action. So those aren't mere words. The Ukrainians are doing that right now. Not only the members of the military, the members of the National Guard of Ukraine, the State Border Guard Service, the National Police, but individual citizens, whether they join the Territorial Defense Force or not, they are taking every opportunity to fight the Russians, to kill the Russians, and to get them out of their country.
There's been numerous assassination attempts on Zelensky in recent weeks and in just the past couple of days that have been reported. The ability for the Ukrainian government to maintain itself and by all accounts, it appears Russia is trying to essentially strangle Ukraine. And we can see now how important Crimea was 10 years ago, being a southern port to that end goal. The ability for the Ukrainian government and the people to maintain a war as essentially your structures begin to fall. Is there concern about that? And how important is Zelensky to maintaining the war? Does Ukraine fall with him?
So in any endeavor, leadership matters. But as I mentioned before, the Ukrainians have a lot of depth on the bench. They are a warrior society. They are very tough-minded people. They have a lot of nationalistic pride, and they believe to their hearts of hearts in freedom. So if, God forbid, something happens to President Zelensky, the Ukrainians have what we would call in the West a continuity of operations plan. They have and a continuity of government plan. They have a plan that if something happens, someone else will step in and continue to lead their nation. Just like at lower levels, if a military leader gets taken out, someone else will step in and continue the fight. So I have full confidence that the Ukrainian government will continue to function as long as they can hold on.
You've got friends and colleagues overseas in Ukraine right now, and I'm sure a lot of the folks that you work with too here at the Guard because of this long relationship. You keeping in contact with those folks, and how is the morale here, just knowing and watching from afar what's happening?
So we're in constant contact, and matter of fact, around the clock. All of us that have friends and colleagues in Ukraine are reaching out and communicating both on a professional and a personal level. On the professional side, we are working to get them the aid and the materials they need. And on the personal side, of course, because they're friends, we care about the safety of them and their families. But I think overall the sentiment throughout the California Military Department is we could not be more proud of our Ukrainian partners, about how well they're performing, about their dedication to their jobs, to their country, and to this notion of democracy and freedom.
How serious is this situation, not just for Ukraine? And we know for Ukraine it could be essentially deadly. It could end their democracy. But for the rest of the West, Poland is on the border. It's a NATO ally. We know that an inch into Poland could threaten World War III. The stakes are perhaps higher than they've been since World War II.
I think this has profound implications for the entire world, because the rule of law that's been established over time, agreed upon by nations, written into actual international law, has been just blatantly violated by a despot who, for whatever his motivations are, that he thinks he can invade a sovereign country with no basis whatsoever. None whatsoever, no justification. There is no just war. This is not a just war. To think that he can get away with it. So I'm very encouraged again by the stance that the entire world has taken, in particular Western nations and NATO and our own government, in order to stand up to this tyranny.
With global stability hanging in the balance, so many have to step up. Or I think what we know of our structure and how the stability that we've created over the past century, which took 4,000 years, I think many people would argue, to reach. We're in perhaps one of the most peaceful times in world history, even though we have a lot of turmoil. And I think many of us are sitting and watching Ukraine and hoping that it doesn't extend beyond that.
Indeed, indeed. It's a very, very troubling time. Something, fortunately, we in the West and the militaries of Ukraine have dedicated our entire lives and our entire professional careers to training for. We hoped and prayed that we would never have to put into practice in this manner what we've done, but the time is now. And again, I'm very, very encouraged by the response by our government, by the West, and by the Ukrainians to stand up to this obscene, illegal act.
Anything else, General?
No, I just appreciate you guys covering this. So thanks very much for taking the time.